The air in the bridal boutique was sterile, smelling of tulle and artificial excitement. Naomi stood on the pedestal, a vision in ivory silk that cost more than my first car. She looked perfect, absolutely flawless. But the mirror told a different story. Her eyes were wide, terrified, locking onto mine with a desperation that made my skin prickle. My hands lay still in my lap, a medic's habit, staying calm when the pulse drops. But my chest felt hollowed out. I am Clara. I fix broken things. I stop the bleeding. But I couldn't fix this. Naomi turned slowly, the dress rustling like a whisper, and asked, "Do I look happy?" The silence that followed was heavy, charged, and dangerous. We have been the only constant in each other's lives for a decade. My life is defined by trauma and triage, by the chaotic rhythm of 12-hour ambulance shifts and the metallic smell of adrenaline. Naomi's life is lesson plans, answer keys, and the structured safety of her third-grade classroom. I deal in emergencies. She deals in futures. It shouldn't work, but it does. We fit together like a complex fracture set perfectly, the bone knitting back stronger than before. Then there is Mark. Mark is a good man. He is sturdy, reliable, like a retaining wall or a sensible sedan with high safety ratings. He brings her soup when she's sick and remembers to get the oil changed. On paper, he is everything a woman is supposed to want. But he is safe. And Naomi, despite her love for schedules and color-coded planners, has a current running through her that needs something more than safety. She needs electricity, and Mark is a blackout. He looks at her and sees a wife, a partner for a domestic contract. He doesn't see the way her breath hitches when a song hits a certain chord. He doesn't see her. I watch the shift happen every week. I leave the chaos of a multi-car pileup, my uniform smelling of antiseptic and rain, and drive straight to her school. The transition is jarring. The quiet there is startling. I sit in the back while she finishes grading, the scratch of her red pen the only sound in the room. We don't always talk. We don't need to. I just watch the way the afternoon light catches the stray hairs escaping her bun, and I feel the tension coil in my gut. It is a peaceful, terrifying intimacy. The engagement happened 3 months ago. I treated the announcement like a medical incident that needed stabilizing. When she showed me the ring, a tasteful solitaire that caught the light of the restaurant candle, I felt the break happen in real time. A clean snap in the center of my chest. But I didn't flinch. I went into triage mode. I smiled, I ordered the champagne, I asked about the date. I stabilized the patient while I was internally hemorrhaging. I became the supportive best friend, the role I had rehearsed for years, burying the reality of my own desire under layers of platitudes. It's the scent of her that gets me the most. Chalk dust and vanilla. It's specific, grounding. It lingers in the passenger seat of my car long after I've dropped her off. Sometimes, after a shift where I've lost someone, where the CPR didn't take and the world feels cruel and random, I sit in my driveway and just breathe in that ghost of a scent. It's the only thing that resets my baseline. It reminds me of what I'm actually fighting for. But now, the wedding planning is eroding the comfortable boundaries we built. We used to exist in the spaces between her relationships, a safe harbor where she could just be Naomi. Now, the logistics of the wedding are invading that sanctuary. The guest lists, the floral arrangements, the seating charts, they are all physical manifestations of the fact that she is choosing a life that doesn't include me in the way I want. I help her, of course. I am the maid of honor. I help her build the architecture of a lie, brick by brick, knowing that every decision she makes is a wall going up between us. I catch her looking at me sometimes, across a table covered in fabric swatches, with that same terrified look from the dress fitting. She looks at me like she's waiting for me to stop her. like she's waiting for the medic to call the time of death on this relationship so she doesn't have to. But I don't. I just hand her another swatch of blush chiffon and keep my hands steady, even though everything else is shaking. It was a Tuesday, deep into the territory of late night, where the rest of the city had powered down, but Naomi's apartment was vibrating with a manic, artificial energy. The living room, usually a space of curated calm with its mid-century furniture and thriving plants, had been transformed into a war room. We were surrounded by the logistics of her future. Seating charts were spread across the hardwood floor like battle plans, sticky notes in neon pink and yellow, marking the territories of aunts who couldn't sit next to cousins and college friends who needed to be kept away from the open bar. It was a topography of social obligation, and we were drowning in it. Naomi was obsessing over napkins. It was a trivial detail, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter 5 minutes after the reception started, but she was treating it with the gravity of a critical care transport. She held up 2 squares of fabric that looked identical to the untrained eye, one dusty rose, the other pale mauve, and demanded I choose. Her voice was tight, pitched slightly higher than her normal register, a frequency that usually signaled she was losing control of her classroom. But we weren't in a classroom. We were in the home she was about to leave to start a life with a man who probably didn't know the difference between mauve and rose, and who certainly wasn't awake at midnight to help her decide. I watched her hands as she reached for the bottle of wine sitting between us. That was where the cracks in the foundation started to show. Naomi has the steady hands of someone who writes on a chalkboard all day, precise and deliberate. But tonight, as she tipped the bottle toward my glass, there was a tremor. It was subtle, a micro movement that most people would miss, but I don't miss those things. I look for them. In my line of work, a tremor can mean shock. It can mean hypoglycemia, or it can mean the patient is terrifyingly aware of what's coming next. The wine sloshed dangerously close to the rim, a dark, violent red against the pale rugs. She laughed it off, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes, and took a drink that was more of a gulp. We were sitting on the floor, abandoning the furniture entirely. The air conditioning was humming, but the room felt stifling, the oxygen thin. I shifted my weight, trying to find a comfortable position among the scattered papers. And that was when the geography of the room shifted. My leg extended, and my knee brushed against hers. It was a casual, accidental collision of anatomy, the kind of contact that happens a dozen times a day on a subway or in a crowded elevator without registering. But here, in the quiet of her apartment, with the wedding plans spread out like a barrier we had failed to maintain, the contact felt electric. It was a live wire touching water. The logical reaction would have been to pull away, to mutter a quick sorry, and retreat to the safety of my own personal space. That is the protocol for best friends who are strictly platonic. You apologize for the intrusion, and you reset the boundary. But neither of us moved. The contact held. The heat from her skin seeped through the denim of her jeans and into mine, a focal point of sensation that made the rest of the room blur. I took a sip of wine, keeping my eyes on the seating chart, terrified that if I looked at her, the current running between us would arc and burn the whole place down. "So," Naomi said, the word cutting through the silence with sudden, sharp intent. She didn't move her leg. "Are you seeing anyone? You haven't mentioned that radiologist in a while." The question felt like an ambush. It wasn't the casual curiosity of a friend catching up. It was an interrogation. There was an edge to her voice, a sharpness that felt suspiciously like jealousy disguised as concern. She was getting married in 3 weeks. She was currently surrounded by the expensive debris of her commitment to another man. And yet, she was asking about my love life with a focus that felt predatory. "It didn't work out," I said, keeping my voice level, my medic's voice. "We wanted different things." "What do you want, Clara?" she asked. She turned to look at me then, ignoring the napkins, ignoring the charts. Her gaze was heavy, unflinching. "You never settle. You always keep one foot out the door." I looked at her. Really looked at her, switching off the friend filter and turning on the clinician. I analyzed the data in front of me. Her respiration was shallow and rapid. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, despite the bright overhead lights. Her skin was flushed, a high color rising on her neck. These are the physiological markers of distress. This is what the body does when it perceives a threat, when the sympathetic nervous system floods the veins with adrenaline to prepare for fight or flight. But there was no threat here. There was no emergency. There was just me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The distress wasn't about the napkin colors. It wasn't about the seating chart or the stress of coordinating a wedding for 200 guests. The source of the panic was the person sitting 6 inches away. The source was the knee pressing against hers. She wasn't panicking because she was overwhelmed by the wedding. She was panicking because she was sitting next to the person she actually wanted, and she was systematically building a cage that would keep her away from me. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick to breathe, charged with a tension that was no longer subtext. It was text. It was screaming. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled with the things we weren't saying. I knew, with a medic's certainty, that we were in the danger zone. If I stayed, if I let this silence continue, something would rupture. And I couldn't be the one to break her. Not now. Not when she was this close to the finish line she convinced herself she wanted. "I need to go," I said, the words abrupt, severing the moment like a tourniquet. I pulled my leg back, breaking the contact, and the loss of warmth was immediate and jarring. "I have an early shift. We can finish the seating chart later." I stood up before she could argue, before she could ask another question I couldn't answer without destroying her life. I grabbed my keys and walked out, leaving her sitting on the floor surrounded by the architecture of her lie, looking small and terrified and devastatingly beautiful. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because I knew if I turned around and saw her looking at me with those blown wide eyes, I wouldn't just fix the seating chart. I would burn the whole thing to the ground. The shift that followed the seating chart disaster was the kind that makes you question the structural integrity of the human body. It was a 12-hour descent into the violent physics of a rainy Tuesday night. The city was slick with oil and water, a combination that turned the highway into a frictionless surface where tires lost their grip and momentum won every argument. We took 3 calls back to back, but the last one was the breaker. A sedan had wrapped itself around a utility pole with the kind of mathematical precision that leaves no room for survival. Yet somehow, the driver was still breathing when we arrived. I spent 2 hours working in the mud and the rain, the smell of gasoline mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the ozone scent of snapped power lines. My hands moved with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory, inserting IVs, stabilizing the cervical spine, intubating a throat that was swelling shut. But my mind was a static hiss. There is a specific kind of loneliness that hits you when you are holding a stranger's life in your hands, fighting a losing battle against their internal bleeding, while the rest of the world sleeps warm and dry. By the time we handed the patient off to the trauma team at General, I was vibrating with a frequency that wouldn't settle. I scrubbed the blood from my arms in the hospital bay, the water running pink into the drain, but I couldn't wash off the feeling of fragility. We are just water and calcium, held together by tension and luck. And tonight, the luck had run out. I didn't go home. My apartment, with its silence and its empty corners, felt like a coffin. I needed a heartbeat that I knew. I needed to be anchored to something that wasn't bleeding out. I parked outside Naomi's building at 2:14 a.m. The rain had slowed to a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof of my car. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark windows of her third-floor unit, debating the ethics of waking a bride-to-be 3 weeks before her wedding because her maid of honor couldn't handle the quiet. But the engine was already off. My feet were already moving. She opened the door on the second knock. This wasn't the Naomi of the bridal salon, pinned into perfection by silk and expectations. This was the raw data. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt that had belonged to an ex-boyfriend from grad school, the fabric worn thin and soft. Her hair was a chaotic halo of curls, escaping the loose knot on top of her head. Her face was bare, stripped of the concealer and mascara she wore like armor in her classroom. And there was no irritation in her eyes, no confusion, just immediate, terrifying recognition. "Clara," she breathed, stepping back to let me in. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask about the time. She saw the mud on my boots, the damp fatigue clinging to my uniform, and she simply opened the space. I walked into the kitchen, the fluorescent light over the stove humming a low note. I leaned against the counter, my legs finally registering the 12 hours of standing, and that's when she saw it. A jagged scratch ran across the back of my left hand, a souvenir from the shattered windshield I hadn't even felt happening. A slow bead of blood was tracking toward my wrist. "You're hurt," she said. Her voice was soft, stripping the tension from the room. "It's nothing," I said, but I didn't pull away when she reached for my hand. The role reversal was disorienting. I am the one who carries the kit. I am the one who assesses and treats. But Naomi moved with a different kind of authority. She retrieved the small first aid box from under the sink, the one I had stocked for her years ago, and pulled over a stool. She nudged my knee with hers, a silent command to sit. She took my hand in hers. Her fingers were cool, contrasting sharply with the fever heat of my skin. She uncapped the antiseptic, her movements deliberate and slow, lacking the hurried urgency of my world. Here, there was no golden hour. There was only the quiet of the kitchen and the sound of the rain against the glass. "This might sting," she whispered, looking at the cut, not at me. She dabbed the cotton against my skin. I watched her face as she worked, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her teeth worried her lower lip. The sting was sharp, grounding, but it was the sensation of her hand holding mine that made my breath hitch. She was treating a minor scratch with the reverence of a sacrament. Her thumb brushed against the pulse point of my wrist, and I knew she could feel the way my heart was hammering against the skin, betraying every lie I had told her about being fine. She didn't ask about the wreck. She didn't ask about the patient. She knew that I couldn't give those ghosts a voice yet. Instead, she just held my hand, her grip firm and anchoring. In a world that I had just spent 12 hours watching break apart, she was the only solid thing. Mark would have asked questions. Mark would have tried to fix it with logic or distractions. Naomi just offered witness. She offered her presence as a sedative, and it was working faster than anything in my rig ever could. She finished bandaging the cut, smoothing the adhesive strip with a gentle sweep of her thumb. She didn't let go. The silence in the kitchen shifted, thickening, changing from the comfort of care to something heavier, something charged. The air felt sudden and thin, like we were at high altitude. She looked up from my hand, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a second, the exhaustion fell away, replaced by that same dangerous current I had felt during the dress fitting. The safety of the moment was evaporating, leaving us exposed. 2 weeks out. The timeline was compressing, measuring hours instead of days. We were at the venue, a sprawling estate garden that had been manicured into submission, but the late summer humidity was fighting back. The air was thick, liquid enough to swim in, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of jasmine and damp earth. It was the kind of weather that made everything move at half speed, that made your skin feel too tight for your body. Mark wasn't there. Of course Mark wasn't there. A crisis at the firm, a merger that couldn't wait, a conference call that required his immediate, undivided attention. So, I was there. The stand-in. The proxy. I was playing the role of the dutiful partner, nodding at the wedding coordinator as she pointed out the sightlines for the photographer and the optimal path for the flower girl. It felt increasingly like a theft. I was standing in his footprints, seeing the view he was paying for, inhabiting the space that was contractually obligated to belong to him. But he wasn't here to claim it, so the space felt strangely, dangerously open. "And this is where the groom will stand," the coordinator chirped, gesturing to a spot beneath a massive weeping willow. "First look happens here. It's very romantic." Naomi didn't look at the tree. She looked at the ground. She was pale, the humidity making stray curls stick to her temples. She looked less like a bride and more like someone waiting for a verdict. "Let's walk the aisle," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the heavy air. I needed to keep things moving. If we stopped, if we let the silence settle, the reality of what we were doing would catch up to us. The path was old cobblestone, uneven and moss-slicked, charming in a brochure, but treacherous in reality. Naomi took a step and faltered, her heel catching in a groove between the stones. It was a minor stumble, a simple failure of balance, but she gasped like she was falling off a cliff. I moved before I thought. Reflex. I caught her arm, my hand gripping her elbow, steadying her. She didn't right herself and pull away. Instead, she turned into the grip. Her fingers clamped onto my forearm, digging in hard enough to bruise. It wasn't a casual hold. It was an anchor. She was holding on to me as if the earth beneath us was liquefying, as if I was the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly losing its structural integrity. We stood there on the uneven path, the wedding coordinator walking ahead, oblivious, talking about petal toss logistics. The willow branches swayed around us, creating a curtain of green that cut us off from the rest of the garden. "Naomi," I said, low. "You okay?" She didn't answer immediately. She turned her head, looking first at the empty spot where the altar would be set up, the place where she would promise her life to a man who prioritized mergers over walkthroughs. Then she turned to me. The look she gave me stripped everything away. It burned through the best friend label, through the years of platonic cover stories, through the careful boundaries we had erected. It was unflinching. It was terrified. It was the look of someone who realizes they have boarded a train going to the wrong destination, and the doors have just locked. "It feels like a performance," she whispered. The words were barely audible over the drone of cicadas, but they landed with the weight of a confession. I feel like I'm memorizing lines for a play I don't understand. My chest tightened. This was the exit ramp. This was the moment where I could say, "Then don't do it. Stop the play. Walk off the stage." The words were right there, sitting on my tongue, tasting of iron and hope. But I looked at her, at the fear vibrating in her hands, at the expectations of 200 guests and 3 decades of shoulds pressing down on her shoulders, and I choked them back. I am a medic. I stop the bleeding. I don't cause the wound. "Stage fright is normal," I lied. The words tasted like ash. "Everyone feels like this. It just means it matters." She searched my face, looking for the lie, or maybe looking for me to save her from it. But I kept my expression neutral, my professional mask firmly in place. Slowly, the tension left her shoulders, replaced by a resignation that was infinitely worse to witness. She nodded, a small, jerky motion, and loosened her grip on my arm. "Right," she said, her voice hollow. "Just nerves." The drive back to the city was brutal. The air conditioning in my car blasted cold air that did nothing to cut the heat radiating between us. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was coiled, tight enough to snap, filled with the echo of the truth she had almost spoken and the lie I had used to silence it. 3 days. 72 hours. The countdown had moved from weeks to days to a terrifyingly finite number of minutes. The world outside my apartment had dissolved into a blur of last-minute vendor calls and panic attacks about weather forecasts. But inside, the air was still. It was the final details night, a tradition we had invented years ago for big projects. Thesis defenses, move-in days, and now, ostensibly, her wedding. But the energy was wrong. It didn't feel like preparation. It felt like a vigil. We were sitting on my living room floor, surrounded by boxes of photographs. Naomi had insisted on a Journey of Friendship slideshow for the rehearsal dinner, a task that seemed masochistic given the current climate, but I hadn't argued. I was the medic. I followed the patient's lead until the vitals crashed. And they were crashing. Naomi was sifting through a shoebox marked college, her movements jerky and efficient, sorting memories into keep and discard piles. I was scanning a stack of Polaroids, the rhythmic whir-click of the scanner the only sound in the room. It was hypnotic, a mechanical heartbeat marking time. Then the rhythm broke. Naomi stopped. Her hand hovered over a glossy 4x6, frozen in mid-air like she had touched a hot stove. She didn't put it in a pile. She just held it, her breath catching in a way that made my own lungs seize in sympathy. "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew the genre of the problem. It was us. It was always us. She turned the photo toward me. It was from our junior year, taken on the roof of her old apartment building during a blackout. We were huddled together under a single blanket, illuminated by the flash of a disposable camera. My head was on her shoulder. Her cheek was resting on my hair. We weren't smiling for the camera. We were looking at each other, eyes half closed, unguarded. There was no best friend energy in that frame. There was no platonic distance. We looked like two people who had already merged, who had survived the end of the world and found that the only thing necessary for survival was the other person's pulse. It was undeniable evidence of a crime we had never confessed to committing. Naomi dropped the photo. It fluttered to the carpet, landing face up, accusing us both. Then she stood up. The motion was abrupt, violent. She started pacing the small length of my living room. 3 steps turn, 3 steps turn. It was the walk of a caged animal. Or worse, a teacher who has completely lost control of her classroom and knows the riot is starting. She was running her hands through her hair, pulling at the strands, destroying the perfect bun she had worn all day. "I can't find the song," she said, her voice tight, vibrating with a frequency that shattered glass. "For the slideshow, none of them fit. They're all about growing up together, or sisters, or partners in crime." "That's what we are, Naomi," I said, keeping my voice low, trying to de-escalate. "We're friends." "Are we?" She spun around, her eyes wild. "Look at that photo, Clara. Look at it. Does that look like friendship to you? Because to me, it looks like—" She trailed off, unable to say the word. She resumed pacing, faster now. "I feel like I'm losing my mind. I'm checking off lists, I'm confirming caterers, I'm smiling at aunts I haven't seen in 10 years. And every single task feels like I'm shoveling dirt." She stopped in the center of the room, directly under the ceiling fan, the blades slicing the heavy air above her. She looked at me, and the teacher mask was gone. The bride mask was gone. There was only Naomi, stripped down to the raw nerve. "It feels like a funeral," she whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "I feel like I'm planning a funeral for the part of me that actually breathes. And I'm smiling while I do it." I sat frozen on the floor, the scanner humming idly beside me. This was the code blue. This was the moment the heart stopped. "I haven't slept in weeks," she confessed, the words tumbling out now, a dam breaking. "Mark thinks it's stress. He thinks I'm worried about the weather, but it's not the rain, Clara. It's the silence. Every time I close my eyes, every time I try to picture the altar or the first dance or the life that comes after, I don't see him." She took a step toward me, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying clarity. "I see this room," she said, her voice breaking. "I see the way the light hits your kitchen table. I see us grading papers on the couch. I see you. It's always you. I am haunting my own life with a ghost that isn't even dead yet." The space between us seemed to collapse, the air rushing out of the room, leaving a vacuum that pulled us, inevitably, dangerously, toward a center of gravity we had spent 10 years pretending didn't exist. The silence that followed her confession wasn't empty. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room until my lungs burned. I am haunting my own life with a ghost that isn't even dead yet. The sentence hung there, vibrating in the space between us. I could have smoothed it over. I could have offered her a glass of water, a tissue, a comforting lie about cold feet and pre-wedding jitters. That is what a maid of honor does. She patches the cracks in the facade so the show can go on. But I wasn't the maid of honor in that moment. I was the medic. And in trauma, you don't treat the symptoms. You find the source of the bleed and you put your finger in the wound, no matter how much it hurts. I stood up. I didn't rush. I moved with the deliberate, terrifying calm of walking into a trauma bay where the vitals are crashing. I stepped over the scattered photos, evidence of a history we were about to set on fire, and stopped inches from her. "Naomi," I said. My voice wasn't the soft, accommodating tone of her best friend. It was flat, hard, the timbre I used when a patient was panicking and I needed them to focus on my voice to stay alive. "Stop planning the funeral. Stop looking at the ghost. Look at me." She looked up, her eyes wide and wet, startled by the command. She opened her mouth to deflect, to retreat into the safety of, "I don't know," or "It's complicated." "No," I cut her off. "No more pivots, no more lesson plans. What do you actually want?" She trembled. A visible shudder ran through her frame, rattling her like a window in a storm. She looked at the photo on the floor, then back at me, her gaze stripping away 10 years of careful pretense. Her chest heaved, fighting for air, fighting the truth that was clawing its way up her throat. "I think..." Her voice failed, cracking on the syllable. She swallowed hard, a painful, visible motion. "I think I'm marrying him to stop wanting you." The words hit me like a physical blow, a blunt force trauma to the center of my chest. It wasn't a confession of love, it was an admission of a survival strategy. She wasn't choosing Mark because she wanted a future with him. She was building a bunker to hide from the fallout of us. She was marrying him to cauterize a wound she didn't know how to heal. The distance between us, 3 feet of beige carpet that represented a decade of friendship, and 3 days until a wedding, suddenly felt like an insult. I didn't think about Mark. I didn't think about the deposits or the guests flying in from Chicago or the ethics of the situation. The ethics were gone. We were in the red zone. I reached out. I didn't hug her. Hugging is for comfort, and this wasn't comfort. I raised my hand and cupped her jaw, my fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. Her skin was burning, fever hot against my cool palm. My thumb rested naturally on her carotid artery, and I felt it, the frantic, hammering rhythm of her pulse against my skin. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of someone standing on a ledge, waiting to fall. She leaned into my touch, a surrender so immediate and total it nearly broke me. Her eyes fluttered shut, her breath hitching in a sharp, ragged intake that sounded like a sob. "Clara," she whispered. The way she said my name, like a prayer she'd been afraid to speak aloud, like a diagnosis she finally accepted, shattered the last of my restraint. I closed the gap. The kiss wasn't tentative. There was no testing of the waters, no gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was a merger of 2 bodies that had been orbiting each other for years, finally crashing into the center of gravity they had tried to ignore. Her mouth was hot, tasting of the cheap red wine we'd been drinking and the salt of unshed tears. It tasted like desperation. She made a sound, low in her throat, a noise of pure want, and her hands flew up to tangle in my hair, gripping tight, anchoring herself to me as if the floor had dropped out. I pulled her closer, my arm wrapping around her waist, crushing the silk of her blouse, pressing our bodies together until I could feel the frantic beat of her heart echoing against my own ribs. This wasn't soft. It was urgent. It was the frantic, messy hunger of starvation. We devoured each other, lips and teeth and breath, trying to make up for a decade of silence in a single moment. Every place our bodies touched felt like it was waking up from a long coma, nerves firing with a sensitivity that bordered on pain. The scent of her, that vanilla and chalk dust, flooded my senses, drowning out the sterile memory of the bridal shop, the smell of rain, the logic of the world outside this room. I walked her backward, neither of us willing to break the contact, stumbling blindly over the boxes of photos, over the debris of the past we were rewriting. We hit the wall of the hallway, the thud vibrating through my spine, but we didn't stop. We moved toward the bedroom, not with the romantic grace of a movie, but with the clumsy, desperate necessity of oxygen. The wedding was in 72 hours. The world was waiting to watch her promise her life to a man who wasn't me. But in this hallway, in the dark, heated space between us, the timeline dissolved. There was no Tuesday. There was no wedding. There was only the terrifying, undeniable fact of her hands on me, and the realization that we had crossed a line that could never be redrawn. The room had settled into a stillness that felt fragile, like glass that had been heated to its breaking point and was now cooling, ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. The city lights filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of neon blue and shadow across the tangled sheets, turning the geography of the bed into something noir and desperate. The panic that had driven us down the hallway, that frantic, starving energy, had burned itself out. In its place was a clarity that was cold, sharp, and absolutely terrifying. We were lying in the eye of the storm. The winds of the wedding were howling just outside the walls, tearing through bank accounts and family expectations. But in here, in the quiet dark, there was only the sound of her breathing and the impossible reality of her skin against mine. Naomi shifted, her movement slow and heavy, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. Her hand, usually so decisive when holding a red pen or a piece of chalk, drifted across my shoulder. Her fingers found the raised, silver line of an old scar on my deltoid, a souvenir from a combative patient 3 years ago who hadn't wanted to be saved. She traced the irregular path of the tissue, learning the history written on my body that she had never touched before. It was a gesture of profound entitlement and intimacy, a claiming of territory she had observed from a distance but never visited. "You have so many jagged edges," she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its teacherly cadence. I always thought I was the soft one, the one who needed protecting. "You are," I said, the words vibrating in my chest against her back. "That's why this is dangerous." The stakes were not abstract. They were physical, logistical, and looming. 72 hours. The number hung in the dark above us like a countdown clock on a bomb. In 72 hours, she was scheduled to walk down an aisle in a dress that was currently hanging in a garment bag in her closet, pressed and waiting. In 72 hours, 200 guests, people who had bought plane tickets, booked hotels, and purchased blenders from a registry, would be waiting for a vow. The machinery of the wedding was already in motion, a massive, expensive gears and pulleys system designed to crush exactly this kind of deviation. Naomi pulled back slightly, propping herself up on one elbow to look at me. The shadows obscured her eyes, but I could feel the weight of her gaze. It was the look of a student staring at a final exam they hadn't studied for, realizing that every answer they had prepared was for the wrong subject. "Tell me what to do," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a plea. She wanted the answer key. She wanted me to be the medic, to triage the situation, to tell her which limb to cut off to save the body. "Clara, tell me how to fix this. Tell me if I should leave him." I lay there, feeling the warmth of her hip against mine, wanting nothing more than to give her the order. Leave him. Choose me. burn it down. It would be so easy to be the savior, to grab the wheel and steer us away from the cliff. But I knew, with the clinical detachment that keeps me sane in emergencies, that I couldn't do it. If I made the choice for her, I would just be another person telling Naomi who to be. I would be just another architect of her life, no better than her mother or Mark or the wedding planner. I can't, I said, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling beneath the sheet. I can stop the bleeding, Naomi. I can stitch you up when you get hurt. I can drive the getaway car, but I can't tell you if you want to heal. She went still. The rejection of her request hit her, but then the truth of it settled. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her shoulders, turning away from me to look out the window at the city skyline. She was a teacher who had spent her life grading others, correcting mistakes, ensuring everyone followed the rubric. Now, she was grading her own life choices, looking at the structure she had built with Mark, the safety, the predictability, the lack of electricity, and realizing she was failing the most important subject. "I've been teaching the wrong lesson," she whispered to the glass. "I've been teaching myself that safety is the same thing as happiness." We didn't sleep. Sleep belongs to the innocent and the settled. We lay there as the blue neon faded into the bruised purple of pre-dawn, watching the light shift on the walls. Morning came not with hope, but with a brutal, exposing gray light that revealed the clothes scattered on the floor and the reality of the day ahead. The storm was no longer outside. It was here, in the room, and the eye had passed. Now, the winds were beginning to scream. Naomi left at 7:14 a.m. She didn't kiss me goodbye. That would have felt like a promise she wasn't free to make yet, a contamination of the task ahead. She dressed in yesterday's clothes, pulling the silk blouse over her head like she was donning Kevlar. Her face was set in that terrifyingly blank expression I've seen on surgeons before they walk into a theater to perform a procedure with a high mortality rate. She just looked at me, hand on the doorknob, her knuckles white, and said, "I have to handle this." Then the door clicked shut, and the silence rushed back in, louder and heavier than before. I spent the next 4 hours pacing the length of my apartment, wearing a track into the rug. I am used to high-stakes environments. I am used to the back of an ambulance doing 80 miles an hour while I'm trying to find a vein in a collapsing arm. But this was different. This was waiting in the plastic chair of the waiting room while someone else held the scalpel. My adrenaline was spiking, dumping into my system with nowhere to go. I checked my phone every 30 seconds. I cleaned the kitchen counters until they smelled of bleach and anxiety. I was vibrating, waiting for the crash. Then the phone rang. It wasn't Naomi. The screen lit up with a name that made my stomach drop through the floor. Mark. I stared at it. The phone buzzed against the granite counter, an angry, persistent insect. Answering it felt like a violation of the Geneva Convention, but not answering it felt like an admission of guilt. I slid the icon over and put the phone to my ear. "Clara?" His voice was unrecognizable. The sturdy, reliable baritone was gone, replaced by something thin and ragged. He sounded like a man calling from the site of a wreckage. "Mark," I said. My voice was steady, the professional lie. "Is everything okay?" "She's calling it off," he said. He didn't cry. He sounded stunned, concussed. She sat me down and said she can't do it. 3 days, Clara. The caterers are paid. My mother is on a flight right now. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool cabinet door. "I'm so sorry, Mark. Did you know?" The question was quiet, but it landed like a sniper shot. "You're her best friend. You know everything. Did you know she was feeling like this?" The ethics of the moment twisted in my gut. I could tell him the truth, that I was the reason, that his fiancée was currently smelling of my sheets, or I could give him the mercy of confusion. I chose mercy. I knew she was scared, I said carefully. I didn't know she would jump. It wasn't a lie, not really. I didn't know she would actually do it. He hung up without saying goodbye. The silence that followed was heavy with his devastation. I felt sick. The specific nausea of triage where you save the patient but lose the limb. Naomi returned at noon. I heard the key in the lock. She's had a key for 5 years. And I froze in the middle of the living room. The door swung open. She looked wrecked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face blotchy, the exhaustion radiating off her in waves. She looked like she had just walked out of a burning building. But as she stepped into the light, I saw it. Her left hand was bare. The diamond solitaire, the symbol of the safe, sturdy future, was gone. The pale strip of skin where it had been looked raw, exposed. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked over to the couch and collapsed, letting her head fall back against the cushions. She looked lighter. That was the terrifying, beautiful thing. Despite the tears, despite the wreckage she had just left behind, she looked like someone who had just set down a 100-pound pack she'd been carrying for a decade. It was a surgical removal of a burden she never should have carried. "It's done," she whispered. I sat on the coffee table in front of her, close enough to touch but careful not to. "How is he?" "Destroyed," she said, not shrinking from the word. "He asked if there was someone else." "What did you tell him?" Naomi lifted her head and looked at me. Her gaze was clear, sharp as broken glass. "I told him that I couldn't stand up in front of God and everyone we know and vow to love him best, because it would be a lie." She took a shaky breath. "I told him I couldn't promise to give him my whole heart when the biggest part of it was already living somewhere else." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The truth was sitting between us, solid and undeniable. The tension that had defined our friendship, the high-wire act of pretending not to see what was right in front of us, finally snapped. The wire was cut. We were falling, but for the first time, we weren't falling away from each other. "I feel terrible," she said, a tear tracking through the makeup she hadn't bothered to fix. "I hurt a good man, Clara." "I know," I said softly. I reached out then, taking her bare hand in mine. It felt different without the ring. Smaller, warmer, mine. "But you saved yourself. And you saved him from a life with a ghost." 2 months later, the dust hasn't just settled. It has compacted into a new, solid foundation. The apartment has transformed. It is no longer a holding cell for my off-hours anxiety or a secret hideout for her emotional affairs. It is a home. The visual landscape is a collision of our two worlds that have finally stopped warring. On the coffee table, my heavy-duty trauma shears sit next to a stack of construction paper turkeys and a red grading pen. It is a strange still life, the sharp steel tools of saving lives, resting against the soft, chaotic tools of shaping them. But it makes perfect sense to us. It is the physical evidence of a merger that was always inevitable, just delayed by fear and strict protocol. Naomi is curled into the corner of the beige sectional, wearing a hoodie that I've owned since paramedic school. It swallows her frame, but she looks more powerful in that worn gray cotton than she ever did in the structured silk of her bridal gown. She's grading, her brow furrowed in that familiar concentration, the scratch of the pen providing a steady rhythm to the room. But the energy is different. The frantic, vibrating tension of the wedding planning is gone. The air is no longer thin. It is rich, oxygenated, easy to breathe. I am reading, or pretending to, but mostly I am cataloging the changes in the atmosphere. I reach out and rest my hand on her shin, my thumb tracing the line of the bone through her leggings. In the past, this touch would have been electric, dangerous, something to be analyzed for subtext and hidden from view. Now, she doesn't even look up. She just shifts her leg, pressing her calf against my palm, leaning into the contact as if it is the most natural thing in the world. It is a casual, claimed affection. It is the intimacy of a Tuesday night, not the desperation of a crisis. I look at her and think about the narrative we told ourselves for a decade. The straight best friend. It seems so reductive now, a clumsy label for a complex fear. She wasn't straight. She was terrified. She was scared of the sheer magnitude of the connection between us, scared that if she opened the door to it, the flood would wash away the sturdy, sensible life she had been taught to want. Mark wasn't a person to her. He was a retaining wall. He was safety. I was the storm. And for a long time, she thought the goal of life was to stay dry. But you cannot live in a bunker forever. Eventually, you have to step out and see the sky, even if it's thundering. We aren't a secret anymore. We aren't a subtext to be deciphered by observant bartenders or jealous fiancés. We are a text, bold, legible, and permanent. Last week, we walked past the bridal shop where the dress fitting happened. I felt a phantom twinge of that old panic, the memory of her terrified eyes in the mirror. But Naomi didn't flinch. She squeezed my hand, fingers interlaced, palm to palm, no gaps, and pointed out a mannequin in the window with a critical, amused expression. "Too much tulle," she said, and we kept walking. That is the new baseline. It isn't the high drama of the breakup or the adrenaline of the first kiss. It is the quiet, steady reality of buying groceries together without looking over our shoulders. It is the way she looks at me across the breakfast table, her face bare and relaxed, no longer haunting her own life. We almost missed this. We came within 72 hours of locking ourselves into parallel prisons. But she was brave enough to wreck the wrong life, and I was brave enough to wait for the dust to clear so we could build the right one. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the floor where we used to hide. We walk through the world now with hands clasped, occupying the space we used to shrink from. It took a near miss with a permanent mistake to find the courage for the right life. If you've ever risked everything for the truth, subscribe and share your story below.